June 1942. High above the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, a single American aircraft struggled to stay alive. A Douglas SBD Dauntless, slow, heavy, and designed for bombing ships, not dogfighting fighters, was suddenly surrounded. Not by one enemy aircraft, not by 5, but by dozens of fast, deadly Japanese fighters. The legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, at least 40 of them. The Dauntless was never meant to survive such odds. Its top speed barely reached 255 miles per hour, while the Zero could easily outrun and outturn it. Against fighters, a dive bomber usually had only one option: run. But this SBD couldn't. Within minutes, the aircraft would be completely surrounded. Its pilot and rear gunner knew exactly what that meant: certain death. Yet what happened next stunned not only the Japanese pilots, but later even the United States Navy itself. Because instead of fleeing, the pilot did something completely unexpected. A maneuver so strange that it would later be remembered by pilots across the Pacific War. A simple action involving one overlooked piece of equipment, the dive brakes, and in a sky filled with 40 enemy fighters. That single decision would break the trap. Please subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. To understand how one slow American dive bomber survived a swarm of Japanese fighters, we must return to the desperate days of early 1942. A moment when the fate of the Pacific War hung by a thread. 6 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched its devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The strike crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships burned in the harbor. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. And for the first time in modern history, the United States found itself fighting a massive naval war across the Pacific. But Japan's early victories did not stop there. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Hong Kong fell, Singapore surrendered, the Philippines were overrun. The Japanese Navy seemed unstoppable. Yet one small group of aircraft aboard American carriers would soon begin changing the tide. Among them was the rugged Douglas SBD Dauntless. Introduced in 1940, the SBD was not an elegant aircraft. It was slow compared to fighters, bulky compared to reconnaissance planes, and heavily loaded with bombs. But it possessed one extraordinary advantage: accuracy. During steep dive attacks, the Dauntless could place bombs with terrifying precision. And its rear gunner, operating twin .30 caliber machine guns, gave it a fighting chance against pursuing fighters. Still, against dozens of Japanese Zeros, survival remained nearly impossible. The Zero itself was the most feared naval fighter of the early war. Lightweight, incredibly maneuverable, armed with two 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. Pilots across the Pacific quickly learned a terrifying lesson: if a Zero got behind you, escape was unlikely. By the summer of 1942, the skies above the Pacific were becoming increasingly dangerous. Carrier fleets hunted each other across thousands of miles of ocean. Every flight could end in combat. One such mission began on a calm Pacific morning. A routine patrol flight, 1 Dauntless, 2 crewmen, and no idea that within hours, they would face nearly 40 enemy fighters. The morning air over the Pacific was calm. Visibility stretched for miles in every direction. Below, the ocean shimmered like polished steel. Inside the cockpit of the SBD Dauntless, the pilot scanned the horizon carefully. Carrier patrol missions were often long and uneventful, but they were also essential. Enemy fleets could appear at any moment. Behind him sat the rear gunner and radio operator, monitoring the skies. The Dauntless climbed steadily to patrol altitude. Its powerful Wright R-1820 radial engine droned steadily. For nearly an hour, nothing appeared. No ships. No aircraft, only endless ocean. But by late morning, the situation began to change. At approximately 1100 hours, a faint glimmer appeared far to the west, tiny shapes against the sunlight. At first, the pilot assumed they were friendly aircraft returning to their carrier, but within seconds, the shapes multiplied. 1 became 5, 5 became 10, then 20. The radio operator leaned forward. Something wasn't right. Japanese aircraft often traveled in large formations, and as the shapes grew closer, the distinctive wing profile became unmistakable. The long curved wings, the narrow fuselage, the unmistakable outline of the Mitsubishi A6M0. More appeared behind them. Then more. By the time the Dauntless crew finished counting, the number had reached nearly 40. 40 Japanese fighters moving across the sky. It was likely a combat air patrol escorting a Japanese fleet or carrier group. If they spotted the lone American bomber, the outcome would be immediate. The pilot slowly banked the aircraft, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But the Pacific sky offered almost no hiding places, no clouds, no mountains, only open air. And then it happened. 1-0 broke formation, then another. Within seconds, several Japanese fighters began turning toward the lone American aircraft. They had seen it. The trap was closing. The first Zero attacked at 11:15 hours. It dove out of the sun, closing rapidly on the Dauntless. Inside the rear cockpit, the gunner swung his twin machine guns into position. The sky erupted with tracer fire. The Zero flashed past, firing its cannons. The Dauntless shuddered violently as rounds struck the fuselage, but the bomber remained airborne. Then came the rest. Within moments, dozens of Zeros surrounded the aircraft. Some approached head-on, others circled behind. The Dauntless pilot pushed the throttle forward, trying to gain speed, but the aircraft was simply too slow. The Japanese fighters began attacking in waves. Each pass came within seconds of the last. The rear gunner fired continuously. Empty shell casings clattered across the cockpit floor. Several Zeros broke away under defensive fire, but many more remained. Soon the Dauntless was completely surrounded. The pilot realized the horrifying truth. They would not escape by speed, nor by maneuverability. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outrun them. For nearly 10 minutes, the bomber dodged attacks. The gunner scored several hits, forcing fighters to break away, but ammunition was running low, and the Japanese pilots were tightening the circle. The Dauntless began taking damage. Control cables vibrated. Fuel leaked from a wing tank. One cannon shell tore through the tail section. Inside the cockpit, fear gripped both men. The sky around them was filled with enemy aircraft. And yet, the pilot noticed something strange. During each attack run, the Zeros overshot slightly. They approached too fast. Their speed carried them forward after firing. A thought began forming in the pilot's mind. A desperate, almost ridiculous idea. But it was the only chance they had. The Dauntless possessed a unique feature: large perforated dive brakes located along the wings. These brakes were designed to slow the aircraft during steep bombing dives. When deployed, they created enormous drag. Normally, pilots use them only during attacks on ships. But the pilot realized something important. If the dive brakes suddenly opened, the aircraft would slow dramatically. Any fighter attacking from behind would suddenly overshoot. And with dozens of Zeros closing in, overshooting could create chaos. At 11:26 hours, the pilot made his decision. He called back to the rear gunner. "Hold tight." Then he flipped the switch. The dive brakes slammed open. Instantly, the aircraft slowed. The effect was immediate. The first Zero, approaching at high speed from behind, misjudged the sudden deceleration. It shot past the Dauntless in a blur, then another and another. Japanese fighters suddenly found themselves overshooting their target. The tight attack circle collapsed. Several Zeros nearly collided with each other. The sky filled with confusion. Meanwhile, the rear gunner seized the opportunity. As fighters flashed past the bomber's tail, he fired bursts of machine gun fire. One Zero trailed smoke, another broke away sharply. The pilot repeated the maneuver again and again. Dive breaks out. Zeros overshoot. Gunner fires. Within minutes, the carefully coordinated Japanese attacks had dissolved into chaos. The Dauntless dove toward the ocean. Several fighters attempted to follow, but again misjudged the bomber's sudden speed changes. The slow dive bomber, never meant to fight fighters, had turned its weakness into a weapon, and the trap was broken. By 11:45 hours, the battered SBD Dauntless had descended to low altitude. Most of the Japanese fighters had finally broken off pursuit. Some were low on fuel, others had been damaged by defensive fire, and many were simply stunned by the strange, evasive maneuver. The American aircraft limped back toward friendly territory. Its fuselage was riddled with bullet holes. Control cables were damaged. Fuel leaked from the wings. Yet somehow, the Dauntless remained airborne. Hours later, the aircraft reached its carrier. Deck crews stared in disbelief. The plane looked like it had flown through a storm of metal. But the pilot and gunner had survived. Reports from the mission quickly spread among naval aviators. The idea of using dive brakes defensively against fighters was unusual. But it worked. The incident became another example of the Dauntless's remarkable toughness. During the Pacific War, SBD dive bombers would sink more enemy ships than any other Allied aircraft. Their greatest triumph would come only weeks later at the Battle of Midway, where dauntless squadrons destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a matter of minutes. Those victories helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. But stories like this one remind us that war is often decided not only by massive battles, but by individual moments, a single pilot, a desperate decision, and a maneuver no one expected. Against impossible odds, 2 men and 1 battered dive bomber escaped a sky filled with enemy fighters. Their survival was not luck alone. It was courage, quick thinking, and the refusal to give up. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.